Bonjour, je suis Lyne Latulippe, professeure à l'Université de Sherbrooke et co-directrice de Taxcoop. Taxcoop vise à stimuler les échanges sur la concurrence et la coopération fiscale et organise une conférence annuelle réunissant des représentants des gouvernements, des organisations internationales, du milieu académique, du monde des affaires, des organismes non gouvernementaux et de la société civile. La première édition a eu lieu à Montréal en 2015, puis à Washington en collaboration avec la Banque mondiale en 2016 et à l'Office des Nations unies en 2017. Cette année, nous sommes fiers de collaborer avec le Forum économique international des Amériques et la Conférence de Paris pour vous présenter un événement phare des éditions précédentes de Taxcoop, soit le Grand Débat. Le débat réunit 2 experts de renommée internationale qui présenteront leurs arguments devant un panel de 3 juges à propos de la nécessité ou non d'encadrer la concurrence fiscale dans un contexte de mondialisation. I am honored to introduce 2 great debaters. First, to argue that a framework is required to control tax competition, Richard Murphy. Richard Murphy is Professor of Practice in International Political Economy at City University of London and Director of Tax Research and a pioneer of country-by-country reporting standard. Second, to argue that tax competition should not be controlled, Arthur B. Laffer. Arthur B. Laffer is economist, founder and chairman of Laffer Associates, specializing in economic research, and he gave his name to the famous Laffer curve. Permettez-moi également de vous présenter notre extraordinaire jury. D'abord, Louise Otis, professeure adjointe Université McGill, juge administratif international et arbitre, ainsi qu'une des fondatrices de Taxcoop. Marie-Christine Esclassan, professeure émérite de l'Université Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne, secrétaire générale de Fondafip, l'Association pour la Fondation internationale de finances publiques. J. Rosengard, que je présente en français, car il est un grand francophile. Il est maître de conférences en politique publique à la Harvard Kennedy School et directeur du Mossavar Hamani Center for Business and Government's Financial Sector Program. Sans plus tarder, je cède la parole à Madame la juge Louise Otis, qui vous présentera le déroulement du débat.
Alors, bonjour, chers amis. Hier soir, je vais vous donner l'anecdote parce qu'elle est savoureuse. Je suis retournée à mon hôtel et j'ai eu le plaisir, je vous dis ça en français, professeur Laffer. You follow me? Oh, sure. OK. J'ai eu le plaisir de parler avec lui une demi-heure et je suis entrée à ma chambre avec le jet lag, me coucher assez tôt. Et ce matin, j'ai trouvé ces 2 hommes, professeur Murphy et professeur Laffer, tout ensemble au petit déjeuner. Et le professeur Murphy m'a dit, il y a bien longtemps que je vous ai vu, ça fait 4 ans. Et professeur Laffer, en anglais, a dit, mais moi, ça fait 4 hours. I says, well, I'm going to be the neutral here. Je vais être le juge ici. Êtes-vous sûr que ce n'est pas 10 heures plutôt que 4 heures? You remember this one? So, welcome to this tax co-op debate. And now I'm going to explain what we say by rounds and procedure. Each round of the debate shall be dedicated to one of the 3 resolutions set forth on the screen. And at the beginning of each round, the moderators, us actually, shall read out the resolution. The 4 rounds of the debate shall proceed as follows. Round 1, first resolution. The affirmative side presents arguments in support of the resolution, and then the opposing side's response to the affirmative side's argument. And then it will go on for round 2 and for round 3. Then will come what we call closing arguments. At this stage, the moderators may ask 1 or more questions. Affirming sides presents further arguments in support of the 3 resolution, answer questions that may have not been raised by the opposition speaker, the moderators, and presents closing statements. And this is about 3 or 4 minutes. Close discussion between the moderator, I call us the neutral, will follow. And then after that, the moderators will conclude the debate, and Professor Rosengard will address you with a brief remark, followed by the decision on the merits. What's the role of the moderators here? Well, moderators will preside over the debate. Their role is just to maintain order and enforce the rules, except in the last round. They shall not take an active part in the debate unless this is a necessary right to protect the rights of the participant or even the rules of procedure. I mean, for example, timekeeping. And the outcome of the debate shall be an informative one. This is not a competitive debate, but frank and candid discussions are encouraged. The moderators will conclude the debate with their few remarks, and you will be invited to vote. So, and Lyne Latulippe will follow, you're going to be in charge of the vote, eh? Okay, thank you. So let's start right now with the first question, and the question will be asked by Professor Rosengard. I will invite the debaters to come.
Ça va. So, resolution number 1, be it resolved that tax competition is harmful. So, 5 minutes to Richard Murphy to affirm the resolution, and then 5 minutes for Mr. Laffer to respond. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning. It's my job to suggest to you that tax competition is harmful, and I do so with complete conviction. I am utterly convinced that it is. Now, when saying that, let me make it clear that I do not think that competition is a bad thing. I know I am a professor now, but I have been a practicing chartered accountant in my time, a serial entrepreneur, a user of venture capital, and someone who has unashamedly made profit, and therefore I have no difficulty with the concept of competition at all. So let's put this in context. At the right place, at the right time, subject to the right regulations so that everybody in society can benefit, competition can be a really useful mechanism for motivating business and creating new well-being for society. I'll return to those conditions. But I really want to stress one other aspect of competition that I think is fundamental to the debate that we're having now. And that is that for competition to succeed, failure has to be acceptable. And failure in business is acceptable. It is something that we've realized for a long time, that if some are to succeed, some will fail. But even so, in modern society, so great is the cost of failure that we have actually decided to literally socialize it. That is why we created limited liability. Adam Smith would turn in his grave at the idea that we have limited liability. He hated it. We do it because government has realized that we need to share this cost of business failure, because the benefit from that failure is something that overall is for the benefit of society. It is what makes effective markets. It means we can afford competition because we socialize the cost of failure. But that is fundamentally different from the cost of failing a state. The state that fails does so completely. There is no alternative or parallel state. There are alternative and parallel companies, so we can accept failure. But in the case of the state, there is only the state. So we cannot afford for the state to fail. The alternative is economic, social, and humanitarian chaos and disaster. And the fact is that tax competition, and I've heard people say this, is an attack on the state. I believe it is. Why? Because in its rawest form, it is literally trying to deny the lifeblood of the state, which is the taxation that funds its activities. And in that case, tax competition is not just harmful, but it has no benign form. Some of you will recall that in 1998, the OECD issued a report about harmful tax competition, which did lead to the question, what was the beneficial form? Well, I want to put it to you, there is no beneficial form of tax competition. It only comes in one variety. But it's worse than that. Tax competition, in my opinion, not only undermines the state, it does something as important, maybe even more important in some ways. It undermines free, fair, and competitive markets. Such markets require that all companies compete on a level playing field and have, as far as is possible, equal access to capital. That is, after all, the fundamental premise of capitalism. Go and listen to an undergraduate economics course and you'll learn that's what we teach, and with some reason. Now, tax competition is explicitly designed to undermine those conditions by providing some companies, some players in the market, with an unfair competitive advantage by reducing their tax rate through their ability to arbitrage the tax system. And as a result, they can reduce their effective cost of capital. And the consequence of that is that they get this unfair competitive advantage, which means they can win where others can lose. The consequence is this: tax competition undermines the state, undermines democracy by denying electorates the right to decide who shall pay tax where and when, undermines the rule of law, and undermines free markets. Put those factors together, and tax competition is always and necessarily harmful. Nothing can redeem it.
Someone raised these again. I always have to lower them. Professor Murphy's presentation was excellent, and his marshalling of the evidence formidable. I'm going to start right off with your position on competition. We all believe that the gold standard for economics is perfect competition, where there are enough buyers, enough sellers, enough workers, enough companies, so that the marginal cost of a product is its price, so that the marginal rate of substitution between labor and leisure is the wage. The marginal rate of substitution between future and present is the real return on capital. This is the gold standard for competition. And I'm going to assert today that there is no place where competition is more important than it is amongst governments. It is really important amongst entities, businesses, but it is even more important amongst governments. The governments have to be large enough to accommodate the economies of scale, but anything beyond economies of scale, where governments in fact take over the markets, is much like monopoly or oligopoly in government activities, period. Now, the economies of scale in monetary policy are extremely large. Having currency areas makes lots and lots of sense. Having the euro makes lots and lots of sense. The euro, the renminbi, the pound, the dollar, these are great areas. But when it comes to fiscal policy, the economies of scale are much, much smaller, and it makes very little sense from my standpoint to harmonize taxes, regulations, or any of these other policies across countries. It stops governments from really cooperating. I love it that we have competition amongst government. Whenever governments cooperate, or whenever parties, opposing parties cooperate, it's almost always for the purpose of exploiting the electorate and the citizenry of the country. And what happens with harmonization is the consequences are almost always negative beyond the economies of scale. They lead to higher taxes. They all migrate to the highest taxes, not the lowest. The EU today is trying very much to get Ireland to raise its corporate tax rather than everyone else to lower them to Ireland's rate. If you look at these consequences, they make no sense whatsoever from my standpoint. They're negative to the citizenry and to the electorate. Now, the evidence here is from the United States, and I apologize, but we have 50 states in the United States that have no harmonization in their fiscal policy whatsoever. Now, we do have a common currency, a common language, but there are no barriers to migration. If you look at those 9 states with no income tax, they way outperform the 9 states with the highest income tax rates and have every single year for the last 50 years. You can look at my book, The Wealth of States, which is a 50,000-foot overview of this. If you look at the 11 states that have tried to harmonize with the rest of the nation, the 11 states that have introduced an income tax since 1960, all 11 of those states have underperformed the rest of the nation by a huge amount. Some of them drastically, like New Jersey, and like Michigan, like Ohio, like West Virginia, like Connecticut. I mean, just terrible. The evidence. If you look at the U.S. from growth of lowering taxes, the two presidents that have lowered taxes the most, the three, Reagan, Kennedy, and Clinton. Look at the performance there versus those that have raised taxes and tried to harmonize the process there. How can you have a minimum wage that applies to Paris and to Zagreb? You just can't. You can't harmonize these fiscal policies. They don't apply well. If you look at this, the concept of failure is an integral part, as Professor Murphy says, to business. Without failure, there cannot be a success. It's the quid pro quo. But let me also say to you that while failure is part of the private enterprise system in competition, let me say that without competition amongst government, failure is assured. It is guaranteed. And because it's guaranteed, there is no incentive in the system to eliminate that failure that has occurred in government. My view is here that harmonization will lead to an enormous decline in the prosperity of countries across the world, and I would strongly suggest that the members of the EU with regard to fiscal policy do just what Britain is doing and Brexit. Thank you.
Alors, oui? Alors, c'est à vous. On va poser la seconde question en français et c'est la professeure Esclassan qui va poser cette question. Et ce sera bien sûr au professeur Laffer d'y répondre le premier.
Alors, nous allons examiner la résolution suivante. Le coût du contrôle de la concurrence fiscale est justifié par les avantages qu'il procure.
The floor is yours. Yeah.
I missed the fin at the end. No, just joking. I'm sorry to keep going on this, talking all the time, but let me just say that the private sector is flawed. There are many failures in the competitive model that attract our attention, and we can see these failures as being stark problems with the competitive free market enterprise system. But just because the free market and the private enterprise system fails does not mean that it would therefore be better to have the government come in and change. Let me just say that the failures of the private system are no less severe than the failures of the public system. In fact, I would argue that the public system is far more prone to failure than is the private system, because in the public sector, there are no incentives. You're spending other people's money, and your incentives to control your spending, your incentives to control taxation on other people are much less in government, and the potential for corruption, for bribery, and for malfeasance in office are much greater in government than they are in the private sector. There is no self-correction mechanism there. Now, when you look at this, it's very hard to explain something to people when their livelihood depends on their not understanding it. And that is what you really have in a government system, because you have a system where these people are not living in the incentive-based world, whether it be academics or the OECD or in government, where they don't know their customer. They don't know what they're being paid. It's really hard. And the invisible hand, if I may go back to Adam Smith, is really the most powerful force in economics and in good government. Now, the role of government must be the role as referee. When you look at the referee to choose which side, what are the proper rules for the private sector to behave, is really, really important. And when the referee becomes a player and becomes a participant in the game, it's very hard to expect that referee to behave correctly and making sure that the private sector and the citizens... Let me just give you an example. When the tax rate's 50%, I'm going to spend 50% of my time trying to figure out how to get around taxes and 50% of my time trying to figure out how to increase output. When you look at this, and here I want to just say that the OECD has done a great job on papers that look at all of the problems here. I mean, tax avoidance. The literature is replete with studies of tax avoidance where governments, where private entities do huge amounts of tax avoidance. The effective tax rate in the US is 1/3 the statutory tax rate, which means that 2/3 of the tax base has been sheltered. When you look at choice of corporate form, Austin Goolsbee shows that to be amazing, that businesses do look at taxes and how they choose their corporate forms. Tax evasion, Perturba, found that tax evasion is enough to explain all the static revenue losses of taxes. This is where the private sector is masterful. Inversions, where you locate your plant's headquarters and what your taxes are. We have had a huge amount of inversions out of the US when we had the highest tax rate in the OECD. Now they're coming back with our lower tax rate. You know, when you look at secondary, tertiary, and quaternary revenues, you know, it's not just the corporate tax revenues. If you look at the payroll taxes, income taxes, corporate profit, all of these other taxes all accrete when economic growth is enhanced. State and local taxes as well. These are areas of how the private sector gets around paying taxes and behaves as it should. And then you look at harmonization in other areas, not just taxes. Look at it with regard to tariffs. Do you think this is a free trade world that you like? Do you think Japan has behaved correctly? I mean, when you look at what government does when it has total control, it behaves very improperly as often as not. Minimum wage, I mentioned to you, the tyranny to spend and to regulate. There's no one correcting government's behavior on any of these areas. I guess when I look at it, in Europe, it hits me even more so than it does in the United States. At least we elect our president. When I looked at how many votes Jean-Claude Juncker got to head the OECD, was it 40 votes, maybe 50 votes? Excuse me, I'm just joking. He comes from Luxembourg, if I remember. He was elected there with just a few thousand votes. And now he's head of the vast organization. It's not a democratic process. And to my way of thinking, what you really want to do is have as minimal regulation as you possibly can, and it is impossible to try to control that without destroying the economy. Thank you.
Arthur, I hear what you say, and I have to say I don't agree. I think there is a control on government, and it's the most fundamental one of all, and we all have equal access to it above a certain age, and that's what it looks like. It's a cross on a ballot paper. Democracy is the control on government. Is there a cost to controlling tax competition if governments democratically elected to choose to do so? Yes, of course there is. There's a cost to securing international agreement at the OECD. There's a cost to monitoring it. There's a cost of exchanging information. There's a cost of enforcing regulation, both domestically and internationally. And I would stress that tax competition is domestic as well as international. And there's a cost of enforcing regulation against those who will persist in abusing that regulation. But it is that vote that matters when controlling government, and not the action of tax havens, of large businesses, and those in my profession of accountancy who choose to subvert the law. That, to me, is upholding the rule of law. And I would argue that the cost of government controlling tax competition is well worth it. Why? Because we will get effective markets that allocate capital to those best able to use it to meet end user needs. We'll have competition in the marketplace, not in regulatory arbitrage. We will have the law upheld. That, to me, is fundamental. And one of the big issues in tax competition is that those who have been abusing have been very much in the public eye. And they have therefore given a very bad impression to the rest of society. No wonder evasion is rampant when avoidance is being encouraged amongst large companies and others. We need to ensure that the state can deliver services, and we all rely upon the state. There isn't a person present here who does not, and I believe that we need to uphold the state in the delivery of those services, whether it simply be the protection of private property to all those other things that it can supply. We need to prevent tax competition so that we can prevent market failure with regard to externalities. One of the reasons for tax, of course, is to price externalities out of the market, which it cannot itself deal with. We need income and wealth to be redistributed. This is, of course, now one of the core objectives of those hotbeds of international socialism, the IMF, the World Bank, and the OECD, who all believe that this is the basis on which we must go forward to create inclusive growth. And I share that belief. We need to defeat tax competition to support fiscal policy. It's clear that Arthur and I do not agree on the importance of this. But if we look at macroeconomics now, there is no future for monetary policy. precisely because we are going to remain somewhere near the zero effective bound with regard to interest rates. And as a consequence, effective fiscal policy is the only way in which we can create stable, secure markets where inflation is under control in the future, and that it must mean that we have tax competition under control so that governments can make their own decisions. And we need to control tax competition to support the value of local currencies. We can see what happens in countries where the local currency is devalued. Precisely because tax is paid in local currencies get value, even when the dollar might appear to rule supreme in so many other places. So supporting the control of tax competition is essential to avoiding those currency degradations which are so dangerous to so many societies around the world. And of course, we need to defeat tax competition so that that vote in the ballot box rules supreme. To put it another way, defeating tax competition is a necessary condition for effective economic management. Or, to misquote Oliver Wendell Holmes, the cost of defeating tax competition is the price that we pay for living in a civilized and prosperous society.
Thank you. Third resolution is mine. Be it resolved that it is possible to develop a framework to control tax competition. Floor is yours.
Me again, so soon? Can we defeat tax competition? I've been engaged in debate here and in many other arenas over the last 15 years asking this question. And my answer is yes, I think we can. But no, we haven't succeeded as yet. And I think that's why this type of debate is so important. The reason why we haven't defeated tax competition as yet is that we haven't fully comprehended the scale of the problem and the way we should think about it holistically. Let me just put that in context. Tax competition, I think, is created and suffered by many jurisdictions simultaneously. In other words, they are the victims of tax competition, and very many of them create tax competition simultaneously. Tax competition is international, it is domestic between parts of the tax systems, and it's not just about corporation tax and taxes on mobile capital. It's about the interaction between many taxes, so income tax against corporation tax and income tax against capital gains tax. And social security also plays a part in this as well, all of which go in combination to create the revenue of a state. It's more than that too. We think, or tend to think, about tax competition as between taxes, but of course it's about the politics of tax as well. Some states are very inclined to political tax competition and others are not. Some tax administrations are very effective in beating tax competition, some almost seem to go out of their way to encourage it. Company and trust administrations around the world are particular creators of tax competition by providing the secrecy that lets so many people get away with tax abuse from behind that veil of secrecy that they create simply by not asking the right questions. And we have to look so far at the effectiveness of international agreements when so many of the BEPS outputs are still to be put into place, and ask the question over time about whether they'll really work. So we need, if we are going to beat tax competition, to not be bilateral, which so many of the attempts to date have been, but very definitely multilateral. And we not only have to think quantitatively about the amount of tax collected, but about the qualitative nature of the tax systems that we need. Now, earlier this year, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, and the OECD combined to make a statement in February saying that they wished to tackle tax spillovers. Now, that's something I'm now quite concerned with. It's a core focus of my work. And tax spillovers recognize the danger of tax competition, how one state can impact upon the well-being of another state, how one tax can impact another. The difficulty with that commitment is that there is, as yet, no effective tax spillover regime in place. There is a quantitative method produced by the IMF, but which suffers from difficulties with the econometrics. To be candid, the data doesn't withstand the analysis. So with a colleague, Andrew Baker, we are currently working on creating a tax spillover framework to be able to assess all these interactions between states to make sure that we can defeat tax competition. Now, it's my belief that if we can actually get states to work together, we liberate states to make their own decisions. We liberate them to make the decisions that they can present to the electorate on the ballot box about what taxes they really want. They can uphold their belief in democracy, their right to decide, they can uphold the rule of law, and all those other things that I've already mentioned. And this is the way, by doing effective spillover analysis, to achieve this result. What would the outcome be? I believe that if we could prevent those spillovers, so each nation state could reinforce its own right to decide on tax as it wished, then we would transform the stability of world markets, focus international business on their true goal of meeting customer need in pursuit of long-term sustainable profit, which those pension funds that I advise say that they are so keen to know about. We would also generate the secure basis of financing that so many countries, including in particular the developing world, are at current desperate need of. That is why the cost of defeating tax competition is worth paying.
We keep jumping back and forth. It's difficult going from one to the other and then the other to the one, isn't it? We are at a major disagreement. Do I think we can enforce tax harmonization? Yes, I do. But it's not a world I want to live in, let me tell you. Now, fortunately, the world we do live in is moving in the opposite direction, I believe. We have gone from, in the United States, I think the highest marginal income tax rate when Truman was in office was 92.5%. We've dropped it now down to 37%. We had it as low as 28. The corporate tax during the immediate post-war period was in the 90s. It's now down to much, much lower today, 21%. All of it moving because of the marketplace pushing taxes there. If it had not been for the U.S. doing its major tax reforms during the roaring 20s, you guys would still be at tax rates that are extraordinarily high and very counterproductive. I don't think the government has the infinite wisdom to know what the right taxes are. And God knows Europe doesn't have the electoral system where you can actually vote on specific taxes and whether you want tax harmonization. And I'm not sure you want to have that specifically what you vote on. I mean, China pre-1970 had tax harmonization, and you can see what China looked like. It was because the rest of the world was open that China really opened up. I was the first American in modern time to go to China. I went in October 1970 with George Shultz and John Ehrlichman and saw the opening of China. At that time in 1970, China had something like 97% of all state production went through state-run enterprises. Today it's down to around 8%. That's a tax cut. And look at the growth rates China has experienced. Look at what's happened with their currency competition. Look what's happened with their regulatory competition, with trade. Competition is really important, especially for governments, and it gets them to behave correctly. Now, you had a problem in 1939 with tax harmonization. It was being done in a very unpleasant way, but you had tax harmonization. That's not the way to go. Venezuela today has tax harmonization. That's not what you want either. You know, without competing governments, none of these horrible situations would have been reversed. What you really need is to have taxes. And I'm going to use taxes here, but regulations, taxes, all of these, they have to be reasonable. Business is not your enemy. You want to have a tax system that businesses and people think is reasonable. They'll pay their taxes then. But if businesses and individuals believe that taxes are unreasonable, they'll do all they can to get around. It has to be a partnership between businesses and government and individuals to get a tax system that is efficient, reasonable, and fair, and then you'll get full compliance. But as long as you try to exploit or beat down or make them as your enemies, you're going to get tax evasion, avoidance, underground economies, offshore shifting. All of this stuff will occur without it. What you need is a reasonable tax code that the taxpayers believe is right, and a tax code that provides the requisite revenues for government to act in its proper function as referee, not as participant.
Thank you. And now it's the closing session. But before, I have a question for you, Professor Murphy. Please. It is argued that fiscal sovereignty is one of the cardinal attributes of statehood. We know that. How do you reconcile attempts to address tax competition with the fiscal sovereignty of states? Or better put is, how do you balance demonizing tax competition with the exercise of fiscal sovereignty of states?
I think that's a relatively straightforward thing to deal with. Let's be clear that if we do not control tax competition, then we don't control the tax base. I mean, the base erosion and profit shifting debate has been well named. What we have seen is the base shifting. It's not the rate that shifts, it's the base that shifts. And people do shift base. I'm amused by Arthur's claim that, in fact, if we had low rates and so on, that we wouldn't actually have a problem in this area. I note that Jersey, which is, of course, a tax haven, has one of the most draconian anti-tax avoidance rules that I know anywhere in the world. Basically says the tax authority can do anything it likes to correct tax abuse because it comes across it too often. I think that undermines his argument. But with regard to fiscal sovereignty, quite simply, a government needs to be able to control the base if it is going to control the rate. Now, actually, I tend to agree with Arthur. I don't think high tax rates are necessarily a great idea. Why are they? I think there has to be a right balance, and I think that through democracy we get that balance. But we can only get the right balance for those honest taxpayers who are not going to take their part in arbitrage and moving base, which is by and large small domestic businesses, and I stress that's most businesses in most economies, if we are able to control base. And so what, in fact, controlling tax competition about is making sure that the base can't move so that the government can control both base and rate and therefore provide a fair, locally decided tax system within its power of fiscal sovereignty. So I think that foregoing some aspects of control and relatively limited aspects of control over tax competition, largely by simply being able to track the base to make sure that things are taxed in the right place. After all, that's all regulating tax competition is really about. If we forego that element of secrecy, which lets the base move, we reinforce the right of the state to actually create a fair base without loopholes and allowances and reliefs which are unnecessary at a fair rate, which can provide a level playing field for all businesses within a jurisdiction, whether national and international, and that to me is the goal, which is why defeating tax competition achieves it.
Thank you. And Professor Laffer, I have a question for you.
I could probably do this staying seated.
If you want.
No, I'm the same size, height either way. So.
Competition between companies leads to larger market share, higher profit, we know, and a failed company. And these variable and likelihoods do not compare to competition between countries. And a failed state means a state of anarchy, dilapidated infrastructure, and lack of social amenities. So, while for companies the word competition might be apt, for countries it's more tax wars. So my question to you is, shouldn't there be more to life than the interplay of supply and demand?
Should there be more to life than just the interplay of supply and demand? I suppose there should be, but not much. Supply and demand create lots and lots of successes, not just in market economies. It's in everywhere. Dating when you're in high school, supply and demand, and competition is everywhere. It's in sports. It's in all sorts of activities. And supply and demand in economics is all about money and incentives. It's all based on incentives. And if I may just go a little bit beyond that, and, competition occurs through government, too. I used to use this phrase with the previous administration. But when you see a bunch of people sitting there hanging around with President Obama, please, 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 don't think this is a group of street people sitting there with him trying to explain what poverty really is like. It's not. This is a group of people who are after favors and who are after privilege, who are after special treatment through the government. When you see what happens with Goldman Sachs and the Treasury Department, every 2 years they switch. They go in government, they write the rules, then they go back out to Goldman Sachs and use those rules to make money. It's not competition. It's really what's happening there is using government as a tool. You don't want government to be your tool. You want a low-rate, broad-based flat tax, providing the least incentive to evade, avoid, or otherwise not report taxable income, and the least places to which people can escape by putting their income. All taxes are bad. Some are worse than others. What you want to do is collect your taxes in the least damaging fashion, and you want to spend your money in the most beneficial fashion. You do. And you know, when the cost of the last dollar of taxes collected is less than the benefit from the last dollar spent, you stop already. That's the optimal size of government. Any government below that is too small. Any government above that is too large. There is an optimal size of government, like there's an optimal size of an industry, like there's an optimal size of a firm. And that's where you have to do. Harmonization takes that and distorts it way, way, way out of form. You know, if I can say, there are 5 pillars of growth, of prosperity: low rate, broad-based flat tax, spending restraint. Milton Friedman's right. Government spending is taxation. Number 3, sound money. There's nothing that can bring an economy to its knees faster than unsound money. Believe me, I know. Low rate, broad-based flat tax, spending restraint, sound money, regulatory restraint. We all know we need regulations. We all do. We can't drive on the right one day and drive on the left the next day. But what you want to make sure is that those regulations don't go beyond the specific purposes at hand and create collateral damage, as they do everywhere now. You want to make sure. And lastly, free trade. Free trade is, in fact, the key to prosperity. You know, there are some things we produce better than foreigners, and there are some things foreigners produce better than we do. We and they would be foolish in the extreme if we didn't sell them those things we make better than they do, and they sell us those things they make better than we do. It's a win-win, gains from trade, competitive advantage. David Ricardo. Economics has answers to all of these, and the economics of harmonization is really, really harmful. That was my closing remark.
Yeah, I know. And it was
Well, I
the
thought
same
I was
for
supposed to do
Richard.
that.
So we've done with the closing remarks?
Yep.
Yeah. So now it's the time to Lynn.
Pendant que le jury va délibérer, c'est maintenant le temps de voter. Donc, c'est le moment où vous pouvez participer. Après avoir entendu les arguments de nos excellents débatteurs, êtes-vous en faveur ou contre la résolution suivante? L'encadrement de la concurrence fiscale est requis dans un monde globalisé. La procédure pour voter est présentée à l'écran. Vous pouvez donc utiliser vos téléphones cellulaires ou vos tablettes. Je vous invite à le faire pour voter, soit par texto ou en accédant à l'adresse Internet qui est indiquée. Donc, soit en accédant à l'adresse pollev.com/taxcoop721 et entrez votre vote. Vous aurez les options pour voter. Ou encore, vous pouvez texter TaxCOOP721 au numéro qui est indiqué ici. Ça vous permet de joindre le sondage et par la suite, vous entrez votre vote, soit A si vous êtes en faveur, B si vous êtes contre, ou C pour les gens qui seraient indécis suite à cet excellent débat. Vous avez donc environ 2 minutes pour entrer votre vote, puis dès que le jury aura terminé la délibération, un membre du jury prendra la parole pour rendre la décision du jury et vous faire part des résultats du vote de l'audience. Donc, dès qu'on laisse 2 minutes pour voter, puis après ça, vous pouvez prendre la parole. Oui, 2. Oui. C'est rapide comme processus. Est-ce qu'il serait possible de remettre la diapositive avec les instructions pour le vote dans les écrans centrales, s'il vous plaît?
So now the few brief comments by Professor Rosengard, and he will disclose, I would say, the unanimous verdict of the. Are we the? No, we're the panel. They are the jury. Yeah, the floor is yours.
So you can continue to vote until I finish my comments. So those of you who are still in the process of voting, I encourage you to cast your vote. You will have the final word after you hear from the panel, yes, even though she actually is a real judge. First, I would like to express our appreciation to both speakers for sharing their insights with us. And would like to thank, again, both speakers for such splendidly articulated food for thought before our lunch break and food for our stomachs. Very remarkable set of comments, and we're most appreciative. It seems like abstracting or stepping away a little bit from the comments, the key issue is how to balance the trade-offs between the advantages of competition with the costs of regulating in the context where states are different from companies. In other words, how can we maximize the advantages of competition while minimize the costs of regulation, keeping in mind that states produce public goods and services, and they don't have substitutes if they fail. So we do have a situation where we want competition, but the context is market failures at the same time. So if we drill down into that issue to be a little bit more specific, I think some observations independently from us is that competition creates a tax ceiling in many ways, but not a floor. And so what we see around the world is a race to the bottom. And this is mitigated a little bit in the United States because 49 of the 50 US states have a balanced budget requirement by state constitution. So they can't just print money or borrow money. So you do have to raise a certain amount of tax revenue to cover a minimum level of services, and you don't have that usually at the national level. So regulation is needed to preserve a competitive tax base to fund essential services of government. And so we're looking at the idea of some type of a smart regulation to mitigate government failures, because often when the government intervenes with the best of intentions, they can make it worse. So you see the need to do something, but how do you do it wisely? And we're not saying that we need global harmonization or unification. We believe each country will have a different fiscal architecture. It will depend on the structure of the economy, depend on the capacity of tax administration, depend on the sophistication of taxpayers, and also depends on the social contract that people have with the governments. What services do they expect governments to provide, and how will they fund these services? And these expectations differ, for example, from Northern Europe and the United States. But we do need some type of regulation to avoid destructive competition. So it seems like there is a consensus that we have not yet succeeded in formulating and implementing an effective regime for enlightened regulation of destructive tax competition. And we believe that this is our collective global challenge moving forward. That said, the panel has come to a unanimous verdict in favor of Professor Richard Murphy, the affirmative. And the last word, of course, goes to the people, and we'll hear how they voted.
Je ne sais pas si c'est possible de voir les résultats à l'écran. Peut-être pas, c'est selon le fonctionnement. Donc, on les voit à l'écran. 58%, donc dans les votes qui sont qui sont entrés, 58 en faveur, 33 contre et 8 ne savent pas. Donc, j'imagine que les arguments étaient très bons de part et d'autre, et puis des personnes sont restées encore avec des questionnements. C'est ce qui conclut notre débat. Je remercie. Est-ce que vous avez un mot?
Juste un mot pour remercier très spécialement ceux qui sont venus des États-Unis pour nous. Professeur Arthur Laffer, qui est arrivé hier matin, c'est un très long voyage, et Jay Rosengard, qui est toujours là, de Harvard, et qui est toujours avec nous à tous les débats, et qui font des allers-retours. Ces gens-là s'en retournent immédiatement, et pour être avec nous, présents, pour nous instruire. Et j'ai donc un remerciement très spécial. À vous aussi, Richard, mais vous, c'est 2 heures. Alors, merci infiniment d'avoir pris votre temps pour le partager avec nous très gracieusement.
Oui, merci. Merci infiniment à nos débatteurs et nos membres du jury. Alors, pendant que les membres du jury et les débatteurs vont...
You know what it is to be with judges? We're in time. You see? There's 7 minutes left. You see?
Effectivement, autant les débatteurs que les juges ont respecté à la lettre le temps qui leur était accordé. Merci encore une fois à vous tous, très apprécié.